So I'm Steph Yu, the Executive Director of Public Assets. Thank you for having me back. So briefly, I just want to share a little bit about what we've been hearing in community meetings and in conversations with Vermonters across the state. And then I think kind of focus on the most pressing problems that we see facing the public education system, update you on some of our latest analysis on how best to address those challenges, and then answer any questions to the extent that there's time that you have. So the main things that we've been hearing in a lot of these community conversations and community meetings are, one, support for public schools, right? Support for teachers and support for fair taxes, but not necessarily a clear definition of what that means, right? And then for community engagement in schools. More specifically, I would say that how that sort of translates into policy is that people want richer Vermonters to pay more, and they definitely want second homeowners to pay more, whether they're Vermonters or out-of-staters. That's the first. They're worried about forced consolidation and school closures. I think there's a lot of suspicion, questioning about whether school consolidation actually saves money, and then a lot of fear about small schools getting shut down by bigger towns and about losing community schools, and fear of cuts to school spending, particularly to those programs that support kids who need it most and make community schools more unique. There's also, I think, a lot of concern about the expansion of vouchers. You've probably heard a lot of this pushback, but again, it's sort of expanding. There's a lot of resistance to expanding the use of public money for private schools. But the other thing that we keep hearing from teachers, parents, students, and community members are that schools need more resources. We hear that students are increasing and schools are being asked to meet those needs with less or with the same amount. And we know, again, I think we talked about this last time, adjusted for inflation, we're spending the same share of our resources on education as we have for decades. And that's in the face of a whole lot of these new challenges, right? Technology, security, both physical and cyber, increasing mental health care needs, increasing economic insecurity across the board. Again, there's plenty of areas where we can spend less and think about ways to do it better, like teacher health care. But we don't accept the premise that we're spending too much on education. So what we see as the two most pressing problems in education funding in Vermont are the unfairness in who pays school taxes and the cost drivers that are out of district control. Both those things that sort of hit all districts, like teacher health care, and also those things that hit some districts harder than others, like student mental health care or extraordinary special ed costs. And again, sort of conversations about changing the number of districts we have or whether we go to a foundation system aren't really getting to either of those problems. So we focus primarily on how to change the unfairness in who pays, both the regressivity in school taxes and the tax cliffs that I talked about last time. I know that the goal here is to really fix what's the current property tax credit, and that you're exploring this homestead exemption approach as a solution. But we still believe that income-based school taxes make sense over the long term, and that at any rate, any rate buy down this year should be targeted to fixing the cliffs by updating those income sensitivity thresholds so that low and moderate income Vermonters can afford budgets just approved. So I'll do my best to make our case for income quickly and then address a lot of the common concerns we hear about the idea, and then go on to a little bit more of what our concerns about foundation and what makes sense to us for moving forward. So income is the best measure we have of ability to pay. Vermont tax structure concluded this, and every study that's looking at how taxes hit people is looking at progressivity and regressivity through an income lens. Now, when we first started our public education system, property was a better measure of ability to pay. People had land and cows and sheep, and you might be selling a cow to pay your property bill. But that's just not how it is anymore. Most Vermonters have income from jobs, and they're paying their taxes out of their income. But the flip side of that coin is that the value of the primary residence is not a good measure of ability to pay. The Tax Structure Commission demonstrated this, that at the low end of the income scale, many Vermonters have mortgages or are underwater, so the value is not actually owned by them. And at the high end, the primary residence is a small share of their net worth, so it's understating their ability to pay. So we did an update of that analysis with more recent data to look at that and really wanted to see how the value of the primary residence relates to net worth. And it's clear that at the low end, not only might you not own very much of the equity in your home, right? You might not own very much of that value, but your net worth could be much smaller than the value of your primary residence, and even negative, right? Because you might have, again, limited equity in the home, but also other debt in addition to the mortgage. So plenty of people at that low end with negative net worth, and that primary value is the primary home value is really overstating their ability to pay. The other piece, and this is true of sort of across the income spectrum, right, which is that the amount of equity you have in your home depends somewhat on how far into your mortgage you are. So if it's more recent, you don't have as much equity built up, that value of the home is less owned by you. And I think that's even more true now, right? With more and more people stretching to buy homes these days, they're putting down smaller down payments. The equity is taking longer to build. And in any case, property value is not liquid. No matter how you're paying your school taxes, you're paying out of your income. Again, acknowledging that we're not saying that income tells us everything about someone's net worth, but we're saying that if the choice is between income and primary home value, that income is a better indicator of ability to pay. This is also sort of an update of the number I shared with you last time, which is that the highest income Vermonters are not paying school taxes based on income. We crunch these numbers more to kind of really dig at this, and the answer is that Vermonters paying school taxes based on property now, depending on the year, they have a household income of above 125,000. So they represent just a third of the households, but they have 2/3 of the income. So, and that's about $13 billion, a little more than $13 billion. This is looking just at the income of primary homes. So higher income Vermonters are really getting a break by paying school taxes based on property value. Property taxes are a regressive tax, so those higher income Vermonters are paying based on property are paying a smaller share of their income to support schools than lower income taxpayers. Again, that's not to blame the taxpayers. The system defaults to the cheaper option, right? Higher income Vermonters pay school taxes based on property because it's cheaper, and they're not the ones that are struggling to afford their school tax bills. So on the case for income, I think the property tax is what causes most of the confusion and frustration with school taxes. Again, the Tax Structure Commission affirmed that for this hybrid system, maximize complexity for all involved, but a lot of that complexity and frustration is coming from the property tax side. Column level of appraisal, the lag, the town-to-town variations in property value growth. And that's what's leading to most of the disconnect between what voters might approve for school funding and what happens to their tax bills. So a lot of that frustration is there. Standardizing the reappraisal process, I think, is great, worth doing no matter what, might help some, but doesn't change the fact that property taxes are inherently regressive and need to be adjusted based on income to make them affordable. So rather than start with a regressive tax and try to make it less so, why not start with a progressive tax and not have to adjust it? So briefly, I just want to go through sort of the most common issues we hear about moving to income.
Yeah, Representative. I'm just curious. How is the population?
Yeah, most people. So 2/3 of the people are under that.
So we're talking about
125. Right. So it's a relatively small group, but it is a regressive tax for that group. And again, that group has much more of the income than the people below the 125.
And to look at the previous slides, I think your point is even if you did pay it on income and subtracted the house value, it would still be more progressive than what we're currently doing.
So,
Steph, did you see the mechanism that we started looking at yesterday with the new numbers in it?
for the homestead exemption,
Yeah.
with the starting with the 95 and kind of phasing out. Yeah, we looked at it. We haven't had a chance to do a lot of analysis on it. That's our next step.
I'd appreciate feedback on that soon if you're able.
But again, I think it still comes back to this issue of property taxes being regressive, and so that's where you're starting from. So you're making these adjustments to make sure that people can afford it based on their income. So a lot of the concerns we hear are that income is more volatile than property value. And I think that may have been true once upon a time, that the concern is that the income tax base contracts in a recession while property values tended to stay more stable. But all that sort of went out the window with the Great Recession, right? While Vermont didn't experience as much of a sort of falling out of the bottom of the housing market like a lot of places, there was much more volatility in property values than there had been in the past in Vermont. Over the last decade, property values have been more volatile than income, although the last few years they've both been growing pretty steadily. But none of that matters with school taxes because we change the rates each year to raise what we need. In both the current and our proposed systems, we are changing the rates each year to get to what we need. So what's happening with the tax base is less relevant. And on the school budget side, unlike with the rest of the state budget, where if the income tax base does shrink, you get less revenue, you have less money to work with. But I also think we need to look at the volatility piece from the individual point of view, right? On a personal level, you want your school tax bill to track your income. When your income grows, so should your tax obligation. If you lose your job, you want your school tax bill to come down rather than being tied to a growing property value that you can't afford to pay. The other, another common concern we hear is that, and I think this applies to a lot of sort of discussion around progressive taxation, is that rich people will leave the state, taxes get more progressive. All of the research, so a lot of these myths, so what we're trying to do is show that a lot of these concerns are not borne out in the data. All of the research on state and local taxes doesn't support this argument. Jurisdictions that raise taxes on the rich don't have net losses of rich people or net losses of tax revenue, right? But I want to start that by saying that we've just done a migration report, an update to a migration report. In any given year, 96, 97% of people don't move. They're staying in place, right? So it's really a small amount of people in any given year that are moving as a result of anything. And state taxes tend to be a really small part of that decision. For most people, you know, your federal tax liability is much more significant than the state tax liability. That's not what drives the decision. But if you want to look at the income levels of people who are coming and going, again, acknowledging that migration has a really small effect on the overall economy because there's so few people that move in any given year. But for the most recent tax data, we looked at it by age, we looked at it by income level, we looked at it even by which states people are coming and going to. And there's really kind of a wash across the board, right? At every income level, it's mostly a wash. The net effect is very small. And the states that people are coming and going from are the same, right? A lot of people going to Florida, a lot of people coming from Florida, a lot of people going to our surrounding states, a lot of people coming back. So, but this just shows that there are high income people moving to Vermont. Right. So of the in-migration, then relatively small, but of that immigration, the majority of people are high income that are moving into Vermont. So we've gained high income taxpayers since the beginning of the pandemic. Another concern we hear is that as more Vermonters age into retirement, the income tax base will shrink and the state will end up with much less revenue. But as of 2024, 2/3 of Vermont baby boomers were, which are people born between 1946 and 1964, were 65 or older when they become eligible for Medicare and Social Security, although that age is a little different for everybody now, but when they're most likely to retire. But Vermonters 65 and over have more taxable income on average than those under 65. They pay more in taxes per return than younger filers. And that's been true for the last decade since baby boomers started hitting retirement. And Tom Cavett made this point in his most recent revenue forecast when he was looking at this. The other issue that we hear a lot is that rich Vermonters can hide their income to avoid school taxes. And I'm not saying this is impossible, but if rich Vermonters are hiding their income, they're also avoiding the state's personal income tax, which is a much bigger bill and a much more important part of the total revenue that we get. If they're doing so illegally, it's an enforcement problem. But again, what's not hidden is the income of Vermonters paying school taxes based on property now, that $13 billion and that 60% of income. But the current system allows them to pay based on property, which is cheaper. So I want to.
Representative Maslin has something, and we have like less than 5 minutes left here. And we're not going to have any staff today, so folks are welcome to sit in the reserve seats.
I don't expect an immediate answer, but specifically on the subject of Vermonters hiding income. I'm very concerned about that. And Vermonters and tax accountants and waters are getting more clever week by week. And so we're not expecting an answer right now. That is a concern of mine. Having acknowledged or heard all the points you made in the last 10 minutes. So just we need to keep that in mind.
I appreciate that, and I think there's been a lot of discussion in this committee too about ways to get people's net worth better. I do think we need a much better picture of net worth because, like I say, neither income nor primary home value is a perfect measure of ability to pay. They both are incomplete information, so we really want to gather more information about folks' assets and net worth to really understand, is that what's happening here, right? I also think that we also want to look at income over the course of someone's lifetime and when they're earning income and when they're not. Again, yes, there's a lot of people that may have unearned income that are hiding it, but what does it look like over the course of their life? Were they a high income earner during the sort of prime working years of their career, and does that change over time? So I think there's sort of a lot of different angles to get at that, but I absolutely agree that we need more information about people's net worth. So I'll run through our concerns about a foundation formula really quickly, which is that as you know, the old foundation formula we had in Vermont resulted in these stark disparities across towns and across districts. Still the case in most states that use one. And if you're letting districts spend above that amount, those that can afford to will, and those that can't won't. And the foundation amount will essentially be a ceiling for poor towns and a floor for rich towns. Again, it's true in a lot of states that use this, and was true in Vermont before 1997. The other concern is how the foundation amount gets tangled up in budget decisions, right? Every year, I think it will get tangled up in budget decisions. Before 1997, foundation amount was often underfunded. And even before 2018, when we had a general fund transfer to the education fund, that amount often got held up until the last minute as we're trying to balance the general fund and decide the rest of the state budget. It gets tangled up in that conversation. And so there were years when either the general fund transfer was adjusted or people just didn't know what it was going to be, which is why we got rid of it and sent the sales tax straight to the education fund. There's a lot of downward pressure, I think, on the foundation amount. We also heard a lot of concerns from Vermonters about kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, recognizing that school districts are starting from different places and that they're really concerned about how you get from here to there, right? What does that look like? And I want to echo the point that Sue made earlier, which I think that keeping up with inflation is not enough. I think that there's not a world where we set an amount and then adjust for inflation and it goes on automatic pilot and it works. I think it's tough. So even though we've been keeping education spending flat with inflation over the last few decades, I think it's fair to say that a lot of under that system, with that flat, keeping it flat, a lot of schools haven't been getting what they need. So there is a lot of concern about what that inflator looks like and how to make it work. I think it doesn't negate the need for constant kind of reevaluation of is it enough? You know, again, the changing of the weights is going to really matter here too. So those are the questions. I made a point on data last time. I want to ask for specific data that I think would be great from the tax department every year, which is we need all this stuff. We need the statistics about who pays. There's no reason why we can't have house site taxes paid, homestead taxes paid, total AGI, total taxable income, understand how that compares to household income, understand how much of our school taxes are being paid based on income now. They do this analysis every once in a while, it keeps showing the same thing, but we need it every year, and there's no reason why we can't do that without compromising taxpayer information. That we're talking about aggregate numbers, but we would love a lot more detail, both about who pays, sort of what the range of home values is that people have at the different income levels, but also looking at what that looks like at the town and district level if possible. So a lot more information. And what I would say is if you're unsure about whether moving to income will work or you think it won't, or whether property is the way to go, I would vote for gathering more information before leaning harder into property taxes, right? We can provide a whole lot of relief to a whole lot of Vermonters this year by updating those income sensitivity thresholds, and then require better tracking of who pays going forward to make the best decision about how to make school tax forward. So I know you're trying to make real progress on some of the challenges facing schools, but there's a lot of distance between where we are now and going to 5 school districts. There's a lot of distance between getting more resources to the districts that need them and the state deciding all of the resources. There's a lot of distance between having Vermonters vote on school budgets and not. And there's a lot of distance between going all the way to income-based taxes and doubling down on regressive property taxes with a homestead exemption. So in our mind, the mandate from Vermonters this year is really about making sure that school taxes are affordable for all Vermonters, which means really targeting any buy down toward those low and moderate income households that are being asked to pay the biggest share of their income to support schools. And again, I want to echo Sue's point about the cost drivers until we address the healthcare, the mental health care needs. And that includes sort of a robust statewide mental health care system, I think, because in some districts, you know, they have to hire employees because there aren't providers in some of the more rural areas. So until we solve that, there are limits to what we can do with the school funding system without squeezing schools and kids.
Thank you very much, Steph. I really appreciate you joining us.